There are nights that pass quietly, unnoticed by most, and then there are nights that shift something ancient, something buried deep in bloodlines. January 23 is not an ordinary night. It does not announce itself with noise or spectacle, yet in the spirit realm, it is loud. I feel the weight of it pressing against generations, pressing against patterns that have repeated themselves so long they began to feel normal. Tonight is not about fear, it is about exposure, and exposure is where bondage begins to lose its grip. I am speaking as one who has seen how cycles are formed, how bloodline doors are opened, and how families unknowingly inherit spiritual agreements they never signed with their own hands. Some call it bad luck, some call it fate, others say that's just how our family is. But what I have learned is this: patterns that repeat across generations are rarely random. They are enforced. And enforcement only exists where there is authority behind it. January 23 carries a confrontation with authority, not human authority, spiritual authority, the kind that decides whether a curse continues to travel or is stopped midline. Tonight is not emotional, it is judicial. It is the night where truth is introduced into places that survive because they were never questioned. Generational curses do not begin loudly, they begin subtly. A sickness that always appears at a certain age, marriages that always collapse the same way, money that comes in but never stays, children who feel resistance toward God without understanding why, addictions that change forms but never disappear, anger that passes from father to son, from mother to daughter. These are not coincidences, they are signatures. What follows families for generations does so because it was never exposed. Darkness does not fear effort, darkness fears light. And tonight, light is being released deliberately. January 23 is not powerful because of a date on a calendar. It is powerful because truth is being spoken into places that were protected by silence. Silence is the greatest ally of generational bondage. Families often survive by not talking about what happened, by burying what was done, by pretending certain doors were never opened. But the spiritual realm never forgets agreements, only truth revokes them. Tonight, the lie that says this is just how it is being challenged. That phrase has kept bloodlines bound for centuries. This is just how men in our family are. This is just how women in our family suffer. This is just our struggle. No, struggles that repeat are not random, they are maintained. I want you to understand something deeply. A generational curse is not just a spoken word, it is a legal structure, survives on unrepented sin, unhealed trauma, bloodshed, idolatry, covenants made knowingly or unknowingly, and silence passed down as inheritance. And when truth enters, the structure weakens. January 23 is the night where exposure meets authority, not human authority, God's authority, and where God's authority is recognized, generational bondage begins to shake. This is why resistance increases when truth is spoken. This is why distractions multiply. This is why weariness suddenly appears when you try to listen. Because something does not want this moment acknowledged. But resistance is confirmation. When pressure rises, it means something is being confronted. Tonight, I am not speaking to your emotions. I am speaking to your lineage. I am speaking to the spiritual history written over your family name. I am speaking to agreements made before you were born, agreements that assumed you would never question them. But you are questioning them now, and that changes everything. Generational curses rely on continuity. They assume the next generation will repeat what the last one did. They assume the same wounds will stay unhealed, the same sins unconfessed, the same altars untouched. January 23 interrupts that assumption. It introduces a new variable, truth with authority. The light of truth does not negotiate, it exposes. And when something is exposed, it loses its right to operate in secrecy. That is why this night matters. It is not dramatic, it is decisive. Some of you have felt an unexplainable heaviness leading up to this moment. Old memories resurfacing, family issues rising unexpectedly, dreams that feel like reminders. This is not random. When a curse senses it is about to be confronted, it attempts reinforcement. But reinforcement only reveals fear. I want you to hear this clearly. You are not weak for feeling the weight of generations. You are aware. Awareness is the first fracture in any spiritual chain. The moment you recognize that something is not normal, the curse loses invisibility, and invisibility is its greatest defense. January 23 is not about shouting. It is about standing. Standing in truth, standing in authority, standing in the understanding that what followed your bloodline does not have permission to follow you unless you allow it to remain unchallenged. Tonight, the narrative begins to change, not because of effort, but because of exposure, not because of rituals, but because of truth aligned with God's authority. When truth and authority agree, generational bondage has no legal defense. This is the beginning, not the conclusion. What is confronted tonight will continue to unravel in the days that follow. Chains do not always break loudly. Sometimes they weaken first, sometimes they crack before they fall. But once authority is revoked, restoration becomes inevitable. Stay attentive, stay present. This night is not passing you by, it is positioning you. What ends here does not end quietly, it ends permanent. January 23 does not simply confront what existed before, it marks the moment the record itself is challenged. This is the night when family histories stop being repeated and begin to be rewritten. Not erased, not ignored, but corrected. What once passed quietly from generation to generation no longer has permission to move forward. Silence is broken by truth, and truth carries authority that bondage cannot resist. Every bloodline carries a spiritual record. Some call it inheritance, some call it destiny, but in the spiritual realm, it is closer to a ledger, a history of choices, covenants, sacrifices, traumas, vows, and unresolved sin. These records determine what gains access and what is resisted. For generations, certain things have traveled unnoticed because no one questioned the record. January 23rd is the moment the record is opened. When divine truth enters a bloodline, it does not argue with the past, it exposes it. Exposure is not condemnation, it is correction. God does not reveal generational issues to shame families, but to free them. What remains hidden cannot be healed. What remains unnamed cannot be broken, and what remains unchallenged continues by default. Many families did not choose their burdens, they inherited them. Patterns passed down disguised as personality traits, cultural norms, or unavoidable struggles. Poverty labeled as humility, abuse justified as discipline, fear explained away as caution, spiritual distance accepted as normal. These are not identities, they are symptoms. January 23rd is the moment these symptoms are recognized for what they truly are, evidence of something unresolved demanding attention. When attention is given, authority shifts. Generational curses thrive on familiarity. When something has been present long enough, it stops being questioned. It becomes part of the family story. This always happens to us. No one in our family ever succeeds. We always lose what we love. These phrases are not harmless. They are verbal confirmations of spiritual patterns. But tonight, those confirmations are being withdrawn. Divine truth does not require permission to operate, but it requires agreement to remain. January 23 invites agreement. Agreement that the past does not get to dictate the future. Agreement that the bloodline does not end in bondage. Agreement that what was normalized was never meant to be permanent. This is where freedom begins, not with feelings, but with alignment. When truth aligns with God's authority, the legal write-off, a curse collapses. It no longer has standing. It no longer has justification. It no longer has access. Some of you are sensing resistance even as these words unfold. Confusion, fatigue, a desire to disengage. That is not coincidence. When freedom approaches, bondage tightens temporarily. It attempts to distract, discourage, and delay, but delay does not equal denial. Resistance does not equal defeat. It simply reveals that something is being displaced. January 23 is the dividing line between repetition and redemption. What once moved unnoticed now stands exposed. Exposure demands a response, and heaven responds with authority. Family histories are not rewritten by effort alone. They are rewritten by truth applied through divine power. This is why human determination fails where spiritual authority succeeds. You cannot outwork a curse, but you can out-authorize it. Authority does not strive, it commands. Tonight the command is simple. What followed stops here. Generational bondage survives by convincing each generation that they are alone in their struggle. Isolation is a tactic. Shame is a tactic. Silence is a tactic. But truth gathers what was isolated and names what was shamed. When something is named, it is no longer in control. You may be the first in your family to recognize what has been operating beneath the surface. That does not make you weak, it makes you positioned. The breaker is rarely celebrated in their generation. They are often misunderstood, but they are essential. Bloodlines change because someone was willing to see what others avoided. January 23 honors the one who notices, the one who questions, the one who refuses to repeat what never produced freedom. Heaven responds to awareness with authority. This is not about blame. It is about boundaries. Boundaries between what was and what will be. Boundaries between inherited bondage and chosen freedom. Divine truth establishes those boundaries clearly and permanently. What once passed quietly ends because quiet. Agreements are no longer being renewed. Curses require consent to continue. That consent can be unconscious, but tonight it is being revoked consciously, and revocation is irreversible. As truth settles in, expect shifts. Not all shifts are dramatic. Some appear as clarity, some appear as discomfort, some appear as sudden honesty about things long avoided. These are not setbacks, they are signs of restorer, erring. Freedom rarely arrives without disruption. When a structure is removed, space must be reorganized. January 23 begins that reorganization. It is not chaotic, it is intentional. This night does not promise instant perfection. It promises rightful positioning. And from rightful positioning, restoration unfolds naturally. Family histories are not rewritten in one moment, but they are redirected in one moment. This is that moment. The trajectory changes here. The future is no longer obligated to repeat the past. What once followed quietly has been noticed. What has been noticed has been challenged. What has been challenged cannot remain unchanged. January 23 does not end as a moment of awareness. It concludes as a turning point of authority. What was confronted is now severed. What was exposed is now addressed. What was inherited is no longer carried forward. This is the night where bloodlines and legacies diverge, one path ending, another beginning. A turning point is not always loud, but it is always irreversible. Once a chain is identified, it can no longer pretend to be part of your identity. Once exposure has occurred, denial loses its power. January 23 brings exposure, and exposure demands a response. That response is repentance, not as shame but as alignment. Repentance is often misunderstood. It is not self-hatred, it is not punishment, it is a realignment of authority. It is the moment a bloodline says this stops here. Repentance closes doors that will you left open by ignorance, trauma, survival, or deception. And when a door closes, what entered through it must leave. Generational bondage survives because doors were opened and never closed. Some were opened through sin, some through bloodshed, some through idolatry, some through vows spoken in pain, some through silence when truth was required. But all doors respond to authority, and God's authority does not negotiate with bondage. January 23 is the night authority is applied. When repentance meets exposure, power is released, not emotional power, legal power, the kind that removes rights, the kind that breaks claims, the kind that strips generational curses of their justification. Once justification is gone, the curse collapses under its own weight. This is why freedom feels different than effort. Effort exhausts. Freedom stabilizes. Effort fights symptoms. Freedom removes roots. January 23 is root level work. Some of you may feel grief rising. Not because you are losing something, but because you are finally acknowledging what was taken. Generational curses steal time, peace, opportunity, intimacy, and clarity. Grief is not weakness. It is recognition, and recognition is part of healing. This night allows mourning without bondage. It allows truth without shame. It allows repentance without condemnation. God's power operates cleanly. It does not leave residue. Legacies are formed by what remains after bondage is removed. Many families never discover their true car, then because they spend generations managing survival. But when chains break, purpose has room to emerge. January 23 is not only about what ends, it is about what is finally allowed to begin. Bloodlines shift when authority is transferred. Where fear once led, Truth now leads. Where silence ruled, exposure now rules. Where repetition dominated, intention now dominates. You are not erasing your ancestors. You are redeeming what they could not finish. Redemption does not dishonor the past, it heals it. When a curse breaks, it echoes backward and forward. It brings peace to what was wounded and freedom to what is coming. This is why generational breakthroughs feel weighty. You are not only carrying your own release, you are carrying restoration across timelines. Heaven recognizes this. That is why support increases even when resistance appears. January 23rd marks the collapse of inherited chains, not because of human strength, but because of divine order. God's power restores order where disorder reigned. Curses are disorder, freedom is alignment. Expect clarity after this night. Expect discernment to sharpen. Expect patterns to feel unfamiliar because they no longer have permission. Expect choices to feel easier because pressure has lifted. These are not imagined changes, they are structural changes. Some chains break instantly, others dissolve over time as truth continues to operate. Both are valid, both are effective, both are permanent. What matters is this: the OT has shifted, the agreement has been revoked, the door has been closed. January 23 becomes a marker in your spiritual history, not as a date you fear, but as a moment you recognize, the night when you stopped inheriting and started authoring, the night when legacy replaced bondage. Bloodlines are not doomed to repeat, they are designed to transform through exposure, repentance, and God's power. Inherited chains are shattered, not patched, not managed, but destroyed. This is not the end of the story, it is the end of the cycle. And from this turning point forward, what follows your family will no longer be bondage, it will be freedom. January 23 stands as more than a moment in time. It stands as a line drawn between what was inherited and what is now chosen. Across these three movements, one truth has remained constant. Generational bondage survives in silence, but it collapses under truth aligned with God's authority. What began with confrontation moved into correction and ended in severance. The patterns that once repeated without question were exposed. The records that quietly governed family histories were opened. The chains that traveled through bloodlines lost their legal right to continue. This was not emotional release. It was spiritual realignment. Through exposure, what hid in darkness was brought into light. Through repentance, doors were closed without shame. Through God's power, authority shifted and bondage was stripped of its claim. What followed? Families for generations did not fade slowly, it ended decisively. January 23rd marks the moment the narrative changed. The past no longer dictated the future. The bloodline no longer carried agreements it did not choose. Legacy replaced repetition. Freedom replaced survival. Truth replaced silence. This night did not promise perfection. It established position. And from that position, restoration unfolds. What ends here does not return because authority has been restored to its rightful place. The cycle is broken. The record is rewritten. The chain is shattered. And from this point forward, what follows, the bloodline is no longer a curse. It is clarity, alignment, and freedom under the authority of